Well, 10 years, Keith. Congratulations. That is so awesome. So I was talking a couple of weeks ago with a friend about a situation that had happened, and I thought you guys would get a kick out of this, and I'm going to share it because I imagine all of us are now or have been at some point in our professional lives a network admin or engineer or an IT person or help desk support, and so this might resonate with you a little bit. There was a network engineer based out of Denmark, and they had a headquarters office somewhere just outside of Copenhagen, Jacob. So Jacob was there during the summer doing some stuff, and he was pulled up his laptop, getting ready to do something before lunch break, and his screen went black, which apparently wasn't that unusual because the company had a central IT department that was based somewhere outside of London, I think in Maidenhead, who habitually just kind of like did stuff without asking anybody or telling anybody. And so Jacob is there and, of course, just the victim of them starting to push some updates to the endpoints. Except for he starts looking around, he realizes, well, they're in one of those open concept office plans where it's like not even cubes, but the desks are kind of low and there's like little half partitions where you could put pictures up and stuff. And so he's in this IT office down here in the basement of this building outside of Denmark, and he's looking down, and several of the other screens start popping off and they go black. Now, the nice thing is it's not the blue screen of death, it's the black screen of maybe you were loading something and there's a script happening. It's taking a little longer than he thinks it should. He starts looking around. He goes back over here, and he notices one thing, and that's that one of these screens isn't black. It's kind of this bright red color. And he looks down at it, and he realizes this one's not black and loading some kind of a script. It says, "Oh no, your computer has been encrypted. You need to pay a ransom." Now this is kind of freak out moment, right? Because now the whole line of computers has gone down. So Jacob's freaking out. He's trying to pick up the phone, call down to the NOC or somebody else, find out what's happening, except for the voice over IP phone also is not working. So they start texting. They actually start yelling at each other across the room. He's yelling at his coworkers because they are trying to get these computers off of the network as quickly as they can. They were literally running up and down the rows, yanking cables, trying to unplug things, networking cables, power cables, everything, just trying to get these things off before something happens. All of this went down in 2017. It was a few years ago, and it was right around the time on the heels of probably some of the worst ransomware we had seen. If you guys remember WannaCry came out of North Korea. It was particularly bad. And then we had Peta, which somehow was worse than WannaCry because at least in the ransomware versions before that, they would encrypt parts of files and folders, get you to pay the ransom. But Petya came and decided we're going to do something better, and they actually encrypted the entire computer at the drive level from the boot partition. And I don't know the rules in Denmark about who chooses to pay ransoms or if you're allowed to do that. So they started to get one of their command centers put together, but it didn't matter. Because it wasn't actually ransomware. What was the one thing that could possibly be worse than ransomware? And I don't know if you can guess what that is, but if you can imagine, just completely destructive code. It was basically Petya, but with no decryption keys. They never had any intention of capturing payment. So this was where Jacob worked, was Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world. And in that time, they lost 4,000 servers and 45,000 endpoint devices gone, including 150 domain controllers that were spread across 150 countries. In less than an hour. This thing moved faster than anything we had seen up until that point in anything we've seen since then. Unbelievable. In the blink of an eye, the entire infrastructure gone and not recoverable. Now, Maersk was in an interesting position, so there's like a little silver lining here, perhaps. Before I take you down a little bit different direction, I will tell you the cool part about what they did is those 4,000 systems and 45,000 endpoints, they were actually to recover a large part of their infrastructure in just 10 days, only because there happened to be one domain controller sitting in Ghana that had lost power. So it was completely offline. And they brought Deloitte in, and they had their little emergency response center outside of London, and they decided, okay, that's cool. So they're literally just texting each other, right, and personal Gmail accounts. So they find this one server that's been offline in Ghana, and this is like the golden key to getting their entire business operation back up. So they said, that's fine, we'll put one of our Ghana team members on a plane. They will bring the system here, except for their team members in Ghana didn't have visas to get British. They didn't have British visas, so they couldn't make that trip. So they actually lined up these employees from different countries, and they hopped the Ghana people from Nigeria, and then they brought people down from London, and they made this little chain of handoffs. So they were able to get this server back to London. They were able to restore their infrastructure and start rebuilding in a matter of days, which is unheard of. But the speed with which this thing spread through is just one example. And if we rewind a little bit and we start talking about like what we're dealing with as defenders in networking, we started with technology-based hacks back in the 1800s. And then by the early 1970s, with ARPANET, we had, of course, just, those few dozen computers connected. And we had Creeper and Reaper, which was not in any way malicious. It was really just a demonstration from curiosity of what could we do with these things that are starting to be connected. And of course, over the years, then those 30 ARPANET devices turned into hundreds of internet-connected devices, which of course were thousands and then tens of thousands and millions. And we're getting into billions of connected devices at this point. So as we follow the chain, though, these attacks, and therefore what we're defending against, have changed. So we've gone from this sort of curiosity and this hacker mindset in a good way of let's see how things can be made and let's see how things can be broken, and then the motive that goes along with it. Because I think I mentioned that WannaCry ransomware was actually spun up by North Korea because they needed to fund their military operations. So we're seeing this huge shift in the motives behind the malicious behavior. So then we move into the 2000s, where we have kids that aren't even old enough to drive taking down some of the world's largest websites like Amazon and eBay and CNN. I don't know if you guys remember that. Anonymous actually comes into the picture over 20 years ago, and then of course we had really widespread theft of credit card and payment information that started happening around this time and ramped up. And of course that continued, and it didn't really slow down much, but other things started happening. And in 2010 we had, as somebody who works in critical infrastructure, something very scary. We had Stuxnet happen, and that was really the first digital warfare weapon against operational technology, and it was targeted at a uranium plant in Iran. The nation-state attacks keep going, so now we start seeing China, now we start seeing Russia. We've already had issues with North Korea, but they're just trying to fund military operations. They really just want the money. And of course, still chasing dollar bills because everybody wants a credit card. And later, as we'll start to see, Bitcoin with cryptocurrency. The example I gave you with Maersk and the network engineers that were there, this is around the time of this NotPetya and then the WannaCry. And then something really unexpected happened. I don't think any of us ever thought we would walk into or out of our office one day and be told to shelter at home and not come back for a while. And so then as technologists, we all had to figure out ways to keep doing our work and keep the organizations running, possibly from miles or hundreds of miles away. And so we started doing a lot of things and connecting things that weren't connected and putting remote access into things that hadn't had remote access before. We've seen all kinds of stories around different desktop apps and things that people are using there. And then it keeps going. In 2021, I don't know who was in the Southeast? Who lives in the Southeast? East, Southeast? Yes, Colonial Pipeline. You guys, the kids had been out of school because of COVID. Now, I don't have kids. You're welcome. I don't have kids. The kids had all been out of school because of COVID. They're homeschooling. Everybody is miserable. All of my friends are hating life. I have no clue how the rest of the adults in the world were getting anything done with their kids at home, but whatever. They had just gone back to school, and 6 days later, the Colonial Pipeline attack happens, everything shuts down, and the buses don't have gas. So they go right back to homeschooling. If you don't live in the Southeast and you weren't impacted by this, it's probably just a headline you saw over here. For those of us that were living in this, you couldn't get gas. There were a few places that had lines of cars miles down the road trying to get gas, but most of the places were just empty. It was kind of scary. The other things that we saw more recently that spread through 2022 and through 2023 were things like SolarWinds and LastPass and the Microsoft hacks. And we started to see some pretty crafty combinations of attacks from hackers along those lines, right? These weren't just casual making use of misconfigurations. And then just 2 weeks ago, we see another warning from CISA about Typhoon being a Chinese-sponsored group. And what we have found is that they have been positioned both physically and logically adjacent to U.S. critical infrastructure across the board. So in the U.S. critical infrastructure is everything from power, utilities, water, to schools, government facilities, healthcare. Technology and communications is considered critical infrastructure. So we see that they have, for 5 years, been sitting and perching and waiting, which is not typical of an adversary behavior. And so now there's a warning from CISA telling all of us who manage networks, who manage network infrastructures, even in our home, that we need to be thinking and doing things differently. And this is concerning. It was captured as the defining threat of our generation, and I can't say that I argue with that. We're in a world where now we have 20 billion Wi-Fi devices, not just wireless, Wi-Fi devices, which is completely unheard of. The trajectory for all of wireless that we saw and all of the little reports coming out over the past 15 years had an angle kind of like this, especially with IoT. But the actual angle was much steeper, and we went sort of like this. And then what's happening? Researchers keep coming up with all of these new vulnerabilities and attacks specific for Wi-Fi. We've got Dragon Blood. We've got Crack. We've got Frag Attack. The list goes on. Like, we could just fill up pages of this. And then the next alarming thing is how many breaches have we seen just tied to these Wi-Fi specific attacks? Not a damn one. All of y'all in there are getting freaked out about all of these new little attacks, and we have had not one single incident in the real world due to those attacks. And I'm not saying yes, you like that, don't you? Thank you, Jason. I'm not saying don't worry about it. I'm not saying ignore it. I'm not saying just walk through the world and go, it doesn't matter, it's on fire, we're all gonna die anyway. But we have to take these things in context, and we have to focus the little bit of energy and time and brain power that we have left on the things that are actually gonna move the needle, the things that are actually gonna secure our organizations. So what are those things? I promised you guys 5 things, and these were the top 5 things. In talking to the pen testers I work with, and in looking at actual breaches and incidents that have happened, I just gave you the example of Volt Typhoon. We've had all of the incidents of things like the water treatment plants. So we have water treatment plants, and then we have pumping stations that have been attacked recently. I'm going to talk about that as well. So coming in, probably not surprising to many of you, at number 5 is a suite of attacks related to spoofing MAC addresses. And I realize that it's 2024 and I'm talking to you about MAC address things, and that just probably seems completely ignorant, but I wouldn't be talking to you about it if it didn't happen in just about every organization I walk into and just about every organization the pen testers test against. And there are mitigations for each of these things. So this isn't a doom and gloom talk. This is a how do we architect around these things. And for those of you guys that spent the last 3 days with JD and I in the boot camp, where are my boot camp people? Hi, you guys are awesome. We talked about ways to architect around this. One of the things being, don't commingle networks that need to authenticate or identify something based on a MAC address with your very super secret secured 802.1x networks. Don't just dump a whole long list. The number of times I've walked into a network access control project and somebody gave me a list of MAC addresses that was so long, and I'm looking at it, and I'm looking at it, and I'm looking at it, and I finally go, hey, George, you don't even have this many devices on your network. What are all of these MAC addresses? Oh, well, we've been, it's all of the ones that have been registered over the past 10 years since we started doing this, but we don't know which one is which, so we need to just import them all in and clean them all up later. Clean them all up later when you have free time. Never. But these things happen, and I get it. But we can definitely architect around these things. Number 4 coming in, again, not a big surprise. Passphrase-based networks, and specifically I'm going to say WPA2 passphrase-based networks that are using the PSK or pre-shared key algorithm. And if any of you know me and you've seen me talk, you know I hate this. You know I hate this. But the truth is we call it a personal network, but every enterprise network has passphrase-based SSIDs floating around somewhere. Because we don't live in a world where we can attach everything using something like 802.1x with certificates or with whatever else we need to set up infrastructure-wise to make that happen. So we all have things. We have Chromebooks. We have HVAC consoles. We have screencasting devices. The list just goes on and on and on. Or it doesn't really matter because we're using PSK networks for our own corporate devices as well. And then the password is just taped up behind the receptionist's desk so everybody can easily get to it when they forget what it is. That's nice. It's very convenient. So the problems with PSK are many, and I'm not going to get on the soapbox right now with you guys on that. But I will tell you that I do think that WPA3 for personal networks with SAE, that algorithm that replaces PSK, is a huge boost in security. Huge, 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 huge. So PSK down here, WPA3 personal way, 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 way up here. It's very strong cryptographically. Number 3, another soapbox item for me, let's talk about consumer protocols on the network. Who said woohoo? Of course, Brian. And last year, Brian did a talk on the impacts of MDNS on the network from purely a network overhead standpoint. It was a 10 talk, fantastic, thank you. It didn't even address security. So when I was writing the book, I started rereading some of the zero-conf and MDNS RFCs, so the IETF specs on this with the standard. And I knew it was a problem. I knew it was bad. But when I reread the RFC, the actual standard document, and in that standard document, it underscores just how really bad this is from a security perspective. I started digging into it further, and I did a lot more research on MDNS, and then I went back to the pen testers, and I said, this seems like a really easy way into the network. And they went, oh, yeah. So if somebody's not using like a WPA2 PSK network that we can easily just pop the passphrase for, we just spin up an MDNS server, and it doesn't matter what kind of network they're running. We can pretty much own any system in that area on that network in a matter of about 5 minutes, which I find terrifying. So I went back later, more recently, to some of the researchers that I know that work in mobile security space, and I said, okay, I'm starting to understand how these devices, so if you're not familiar with these devices, the zero-conf suite of devices, zero-conf meaning zero configuration, were designed to work on consumer or residential products in the absence of enterprise network services. So in your home where you might not have, oh, who am I kidding? You guys have DNS and DHCP servers in your home. So let me back up. In a home where most people don't have full network stacks. So they kind of act as their own little shadow layer, their shadow network down here, and they communicate using protocols that you are probably not really watching, and that you don't really, even if you were watching it, you don't really have a lot of control over, especially when they start communicating to each other directly. So as I dug more into this, because I am not a mobile platform specialist, I asked one of my researcher friends, and what I have come to learn is that it's already these protocols are being used by nation-state actors in ways, I'm going to say, as far as I know, because I have no cool insider knowledge, not targeted at us directly, and most of this activity is outside of the US, but it is something that I have a very deep gut feeling about, that this is something I'm concerned about moving forward as we're starting to defend our networks, both from the pen tester who's doing our assessment for us, but also the nation states that have more advanced tooling than we do. Number 2, I know, it's not hot, it's not sexy, it's just default passwords. When I got a couple of requests from people, so one of the things that tends to happen is I'm very much a realist. I don't panic when news comes out and there's vulnerabilities. And so a lot of times different organizations or media or somebody will call me and they'll say, hey, JJ, this new thing just happened. Do we need to worry about it? Most of the time I'm thinking, no, not so much. Not so much, and then it wasn't some really sophisticated attack. And one of those things that happened recently was one of those water stations, the pumping stations, it got blown up all over the headlines. Nation states attacking U.S. water treatment plants and distribution, and it's not that it's not true, but it was really blown out of proportion, because if you looked and you saw what happened, a lot of these operational technology systems have PLCs, and some of them have integrated human-machine interfaces. So what this means is you don't need like special knowledge of the system, because it presents a little web page to you. It'll have a panel if you're physically in front of it with a screen with pictures. Even I know what the pictures mean. Or if you get into it remotely, you get a web interface. It also has pictures on it, and you could just click on the pictures and you can make changes. And some of these are integrated, and some of these are set up such that if you connect them to Ethernet, their remote accessibility is automatically enabled. And if you're at something like a remote pumping station, which is it just sits out there, it checks water pressure, and if it feels like it needs to turn a pump on to push water a little further outside of the city limit, then it does that. So it's nothing too crazy. But the default password for this particular model, which I easily found on the internet in about 3 minutes thanks to Google, was 1111. 1111 for something that when you plugged it in, automatically spun up a remote access console and was probably in a place that wasn't sitting behind a firewall and getting natted, and so it's very easily accessible. So we have all of these attacks. When you look at the breaches that we have, when you look at the headline news, It's usually not sophisticated actors who have done crazy things. SolarWind's a little bit of an exception. That was definitely a long-term supply chain attack that was very well thought out. LastPass. Did you guys hear about the LastPass breach? So LastPass, if you're not familiar with it, is a password vaulting application. So the entire existence of this company is to secure its customers' passwords in the cloud. They were breached. They were breached because they had 4 developers who each had keys to the kingdom in terms of full access to the production and the development environments. And one of these 4 developers accessed that production environment from his home, where his home network had been compromised through a Plex server. Keyloggers and Plex server attacks. Cloudflare recently announced some of the issues with Okta. So if you guys are familiar with Okta and you've heard about the Okta breach, Okta, also an IDM authentication security company, some of their systems were breached through a help structure. They advise their customers to rotate all the tokens. Cloudflare, and I'm not picking on Cloudflare, this could happen to anybody, they actually rotated thousands of tokens and credentials, but they missed a handful, and I say like 4. But you missed the 4, and of course something is going to happen with one of those 4. And what had happened was one of their employees at Okta had logged in to their personal Google account on a work machine. Some things accidentally got saved to that, and that's how the attackers were able to breach it. So again, not crazy, sophisticated, super secret squirrel ninja attacks happening here. The number of infrastructures we go into and we test that have default passwords, and maybe they're on an interface that you don't even know is there because you're not using it. We have a long list of hardening requirements and recommendations with things like, if you're not using a protocol, please disable it. If you are using a protocol, please use the encrypted version of it. Which is completely impossible sometimes, because working in this space and working with some of the Wi-Fi vendors and the network vendors, what I have come to find out is that a lot of them, for example, require you to use TFTP for certain things. And so then our operating procedure is, in a secured environment, and this is what we do, TFTP is not enabled. We need to do something. We come over here. We enable TFTP. We mark that change management window. We do what we need to do. We come back in. We turn off TFTP. That just sounds like a miserable freaking existence, doesn't it? But these are the things that we're dealing with, and these are the limitations that we have, and these are the stumbling blocks that we're trying to work around. So no matter how basic it feels and how silly it sounds, these are the things that we need to be paying attention to in our network infrastructures. The number one, kind of a big bucket to catch a lot of things here, is misconfigurations. So I think a lot of us, we inherit something from somebody else, or I inherit something from myself because I did it 3 weeks ago and I've completely forgotten what I did 3 weeks ago. And things change. And sometimes things change for the better, but sometimes things change for the worse. Stuff gets moved, somebody else did it, you come back in, you don't know where it went, you didn't document something because in the heat of the moment, you just needed to get it done. So we end up with misconfigurations. We end up with that list of things that we were going to go back and do or undo and harden or fix or lock down, or the MAC addresses we were going to clean up, and it never happens. And I get it, because we're already working 10, 12, 15, 16-hour days a lot of the time. We're already dealing with organizations and people and friends and coworkers and who this is the shiny object and the priority today, and then before you get too far down that path, suddenly this is the priority. In our boot camp, we talked about a little bit about some of the controls frameworks that are laid out for us. Controls frameworks being things like the CIS controls. NIST has the cybersecurity framework, and it informs us of like the things to do. If you do nothing else, do these things. And it's a great little way to go do checklists and to come back after we've done something and see if we have misconfigurations in place. And typically what I see, and typically what the pen testers see, is these misconfigurations are usually related to things like overly permissive access, bad segmentation, getting down to 802.1x that is not configured properly. These protocols are only as secure as we implement them. And there are 12 right ways to do things, but there are 63 wrong ways to do it. So the odds aren't always in our favor. And then what's happening? So we have pen testers, we have malicious actors. Sometimes we also just have unwitting team members and people in our organization who are not acting maliciously, but it's still an insider threat. We're moving into the world where we're talking about zero trust architectures, where we're talking about tightening the screws a little bit on access. We're talking about getting control over privileged access management. And as all of these things are happening in the world, the network infrastructures are starting to become more of a target than they ever were before. We've seen platform-based targets for a long time, and now it's coming back around to the networks. And now is the time that we need to start thinking about securing these infrastructures better. I am not an offensive specialist. My work is as a defensive architect. And so my kind of call to action for you guys, if you are sitting in here, my feeling about technical professionals, my feeling about the people that are in here, you being curious about things, wanting to know how things work, wanting to know how things break, you are the best chance we have at securing these infrastructures. There is nobody in the world of cybersecurity who's going to do a better job defending and architecting your networks and the products you work with and the infrastructures that you work with than you. And it's why I'm here. It's why I don't mind working and staying up late and doing boot camps and doing deep dives and answering questions and learning from you. Because I think that we can do this all together. And I think that if any of you are interested in anything related to security, I would love to stay connected. I would love to see you be up here and talking about what you're doing and what you're learning, even if it's a 10 talk. I would love to see you sharing. I would love to see your blog post, because there are lots of things we can do to help each other, and we can make this easier. And the one thing that I'm going to do for you guys, because I got permission from Wiley, everybody told me, you want to know more about 802.1x. So I went to Wiley and I said, hey, Wiley, I wrote this book. You own the rights to it. Can I give away an entire chapter on 802.1x and radius and EAP authentication to people for free? And they said yes. So here for WLPC, for the 10-year anniversary, you have an entire ebook on 802.1x, EAP, and radius. And I know what you're all thinking. The security person just put up a QR code. So 2 things. If you hover over it, you will see it goes to my website, which is Vision Security. And number 2, it's not like y'all didn't go out to dinner last night and look at the menu with the QR code anyway, right? Like, there's definitely bigger threats out there. If this is the biggest problem we have to deal with, that this is what you're scared of, we've got problems. Also, I am standing up here now joining Keith as part of the Packet Pushers Network. We have started a cybersecurity podcast called Packet Protector. Where we're going to be talking about everything cybersecurity for network engineers and architects. And so we've pre-recorded the first few episodes. We released the first one last week. We talked about WPA3 security in that. We have already talked to some offensive people about red team and purple team. We've talked to a pen tester. We've talked to SANS about the training and certification and pursuing professional skills. and what they're seeing in that space. And so I would also kind of invite you guys all to participate in that conversation with us on Twitter. Give us feedback at packetpushers.net/FU. Tell us about the topics that you want to learn about, and we will go find the people. Because here's the one thing I've learned. I've worked in technology for 30 years this year. I have done network engineering and network security architecture for about 20 of those years. I have no freaking clue what's going on half the time. I have questions, so I'm kind of figuring that if I have questions, probably other people have questions too. And so we're going to learn together, and we're going to answer those questions. And I'm really excited about taking that journey with you all and joining Keith and joining the Packet Pushers Network. And I'm going to wrap up a little bit early because I know that there is a nice gentleman next, and then UC is up, and UC always runs long. So thank you guys all. Enjoy your conference.